Kalorama, a Recorded Books Highbridge imprint, presents Democracy, a Guided Tour, by Jason Brennan. Read by Jonathan Todd Ross. Preface and Acknowledgements. This book provides a guided, curated tour of the major arguments in philosophy, political science, and economics for and against democracy over the past 2,500 years. I'm not a neutral observer, but I got where I am by considering the options and the arguments for and against those options. I've written at great deal about the various pathologies and shortcomings of democracy. At the same time, I'm in a way a fan of democracy. I often joke I'm its truest fan, because a true fan admits when a band has a bad album or an institution has flaws. Democracy is perhaps the best political system we've tried so far, but it has serious issues. I hope that listeners can come away from this book understanding the promises and perils of democracy. I especially hope that they can see that the issues are not simple. Too often, democracy's defenders ignore its problems or evade them by mouthing platitudes about how the problems of democracy can be solved with more democracy, or that any dysfunctional real-world democracy is not true democracy anyway. Instead, I hope listeners see that institutional design is difficult. In the real world, we cannot rely on our good intentions. Translating abstract principles of justice into functional institutions means understanding how real-world actors will respond to the often perverse incentives our institutions create. If we care about justice, we don't throw up our hands and say, "That's not real democracy." We acknowledge the problems and look for feasible solutions. This is a history of thought book written for the kinds of people who are not interested in the history of thought for the sake of the history of thought. For historians of philosophy, the action is often in clarifying the most obscure passages from long-dead theorists, drawing out their implicit but unstated views on topics, or puzzling over whether translating a word this way or that way affects our understanding of the theorist's views. Sometimes historians are tempted to argue that philosophers famous for arguing X really mean not X. That's not my interest here. Indeed, that's one reason I mostly stick to public domain, open-access translations of philosophers when quoting them. I want listeners to examine arguments from the past that are interesting not because they are from the past, but because they continue to shine light on democracy today. In this case, we should examine what Plato and Aristotle said, not because Plato and Aristotle said it, but because we should be concerned with the issues they raised. At the same time, we live in a golden age of democratic theory. We have better data and better research methods than those that came before us. We can see farther, not merely because we stand on their shoulders, but because we have better eyes and a bigger world to look at. For that reason, every chapter will bring listeners up to current work. Debates about democracy did not end in, say, 1848, when there were hardly any democracies. Much of the best work in the history of thought appeared in the last 70 or even 20 years. Writing a book like this is a bit like trying to curate a best-of album for the Beatles. Sure, there are some things that absolutely must be included, such as Yesterday or Plato's Republic. But then, after getting the obvious hits, we have lots of options for filling out the rest. I must discuss Plato, Aristotle, Rousseau, de Tocqueville, and John Stuart Mill, but it's largely optional whether and how much I cover, say, Diderot, Montesquieu, Schmitt, or Nietzsche. Of course, just as with compiling a best-of album for the Beatles, reasonable people will disagree about which songs are necessary and optional. Even if this book were 3 times the length, I would have to make choices. Chapter 1. Democracy. Why or why not? For and against. Democracy is both an obvious and dubious idea. Here's why democracy is an obvious idea. For most of history, most governments divided people into the few who rule and the many who obey. The few then used the state to advance their own private interests at the expense of the many. Rulers were less like noble protectors appointed by God, and more like intestinal parasites. The obvious solution is to eliminate the distinction between those who rule and those who obey. Make every citizen both a ruler and a subject of that rule. This ensures government promotes everyone's interests. Thus, democracy is the best form of government. It's too bad it took most of civilized history to realize this. And too bad that the world isn't more democratic than it is. Here's why democracy is a dubious idea. Government decisions are high stakes. It decides matters of war and peace, prosperity and poverty, freedom or oppression. Yet we let incompetent people steer the ship of state. Most voters are ignorant and process what little information they have in biased and irrational ways. They fall prey to propaganda and demagogues. They are conformists and don't even try to vote their interests. Democracy is the political equivalent of drunk driving. Thus, democracy is a defective form of government. Democracy is a method by which the masses shoot themselves in their feet. Philosophy students often start essays by writing, "Since the dawn of time, humanity has pondered." In this case, these arguments and concerns are old, if not dawn of time old. We can find laypeople, pundits, social scientists, and philosophers making these two arguments today. But in ancient Athens, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle said similar things. Today, many Westerners assume that democracy is not only the best form of government, but also the only legitimate form. Yet at the same time, most admit that democracy, as we find it, has serious problems. Most of these problems, they'll add, could be fixed, if only their favorite party had uncontested power. For most of Western history, the word democracy was pejorative. Aristotle used the term democracy to refer to the degenerate or deviant form of the rule of the many. Today, you can still find smug AP US history students saying, "The United States is a republic, not a democracy." Here, speakers insist on using the word as it was used in the 1700s, where democracy connoted something like the unconstrained tyranny of the majority. But today in the West, the word democracy also often connotes an unassailable ideal. People tend to presume that of course we ought to have democracy. The only interesting questions are which form of democracy is best, or how much of life should be subject to democratic control. Democracy is so ascendant an ideal that non-democratic countries pretend to be democratic. In 1936, Hitler held a sham referendum asking citizens whether they favored the German occupation of the Rhineland and Nazi rule. On paper, the 1936 Soviet Constitution vested the supreme power of the state in a national legislature elected through universal, direct, and equal suffrage by secret ballot, with voting rights extended to all women and ethnic minorities. But the USSR was not democratic in 1986 under Gorbachev, let alone under Stalin. Today's dictators or semi-dictators, such as Indonesia's Suharto, Egypt's Mubarak, or Russia's Putin, host rigged elections. In the countries where the people have little power, the people with power nevertheless proclaim that the people empowered them. How things have changed! Back in the day, Louis XIV, Genghis Khan, Darius, and Xerxes, and Muhammad felt no compunction to pretend that they derived their authority from their subjects. Their right to rule came from God, from birth, or from the sword. Despite democracy's ascendant status, many scholars believe democracy is in decline. The Economist Intelligence Unit, The research division of the group that publishes The Economist magazine produces an annual democracy index that rates countries on a 1 to 10 scale from least to most democratic. Freedom House, a U.S. government-funded research organization, produces a similar ranking. Both hold that the total number of democracies dropped over the past 20 years. In 2020, about 70% of the countries in the Democracy Index received a lower overall score. In 2017, The Economist downgraded the United States from a full democracy to a flawed democracy, though you might wonder whether this reflects partisan disdain for Trump. Political theorists call this phenomenon democratic backsliding. Around the world, large populist movements are unhappy with democracy. People believe that their democratic governments are too slow and inefficient. They believe their democracies are captured by insiders and bureaucrats who promote elite interests but ignore the masses. The people's response to these perceived problems is surprising. To ensure the system represents the people better, they should install a strongman and remove constraints on his power. In practice, populism leads to authoritarianism, not democracy. Why do people think all these ways? Why do such contradictory ideas appeal to so many, and often to the same people? This book offers part of the answer. My goal is to give you a guided tour of the best and most important arguments for and against democracy over time. I want you to understand why a reasonable person might think democracy is the ideal form of government, and that all the problems of democracy can be fixed with more democracy. I also want you to understand why a reasonable person might think democracy has built-in flaws that must be contained, or why democracy is simply bad. I want you to see why a reasonable person might think democracy is the end of history, and why a reasonable person might think the era of democracy should give way to something better. How to value democracy. We value different things in different ways. Consider how we value hammers. We regard hammers as tools. We don't value them for their own sake, but because they help us accomplish our goals. The point of a claw hammer is to pound in or remove nails. A good hammer must be good for us as we are. A hammer fit for a giant or superhero might be a bad hammer for people like us. No one would insist on using a hammer when a different tool like a wrench is more effective. No one would insist on using a poor quality hammer when a better quality hammer is easily available. Consider how we value paintings. A painting might be useful the way a hammer is. For instance, you could swat flies with a Matisse, or you could sell it. But we also typically care about who made the painting. If Picasso scribbles on a napkin, the napkin is worth $50,000. If I make identical scribbles on a napkin, the napkin is ruined. We also care about what the painting symbolizes or expresses, or how it makes us feel. Paintings are valuable because of their genesis, and because of what they express. Consider how we value people. Like hammers, people can be useful. Like paintings, we care about who made them, or what they express. But we also tend to say that people are ends or values in themselves. When it comes to democracy, the debate is not merely over what value democracy has, but how democracy should be valued. Perhaps democracy is instrumentally valuable, the way hammers are. That is, maybe one way to judge democracy and its competitors is by asking whether democracy is useful for real people like us, as a mechanism for delivering independent values. Maybe democracy is good because it tends to make wise decisions that track the independent truth about what justice requires. Maybe it tends to promote freedom, equal outcomes, the rule of law, general economic prosperity, good culture, tolerance, or some other values. Maybe it is good not because it makes smart decisions, but because it tends to avoid terrible decisions. Or maybe not. As we will see, many of the arguments about the value or disvalue of democracy concern things like this. Perhaps democracy is valuable the way paintings are. For instance, many people think that democratic decisions are rendered good and just because of who made them. Democratic decisions are right because we decided them. In their view, if we the people vote to cut taxes, that makes it right to do so. But if a benevolent dictator had imposed that very same tax cut upon us for the same reasons, it would not be just or right. Or many people think that what makes democracy good is not that it produces equal outcomes, but that it expresses the idea that we are all equal. On this view, having a democracy is like having a banner declaring, "All people matter the same." As we will see, many of the arguments about the value or disvalue of democracy concern issues like these. Perhaps democracy is valuable as an end in itself, just as people are. Still, if people are ends in themselves, there must be something about people that makes them ends in themselves, some feature that people have that makes their lives have inherent value. For what it's worth, philosophers have surprising difficulty explaining what this feature or set of features might be. Perhaps it is because human beings are moral agents, or can reason, or have free will, or whatnot. If so, the philosopher Peter Singer asks, what about the human beings, such as the severely disabled, infirm, or very young, who aren't moral agents, cannot reason, or who lack free will? Similarly, if democracy is an end in itself, or if it is inherently just and good, there must be some feature of democracy that makes it so. Perhaps it is because it is fair, equal, or free. But what if it's not? As we will see, philosophical disagreements about the value of democracy are often about how to value democracy. Is it instrumentally useful, symbolically valuable, an end in itself, or are democratic decisions good, simply because the right people made them the right way? The sixth grade model of democracy. Disagreements about the value of democracy often rest not disagreements about moral principles, but on empirical disputes about how democracy functions. In my experience, most citizens, journalists, college students, and so on in the United States and Western Europe tend to share the same basic model of how democracy works. They share this model because they learned it in civics courses around 6th grade. Thus, let's call this the 6th grade model. First, the 6th grade model holds that citizens know their own interests, values, and concerns. The model doesn't posit that everyone is selfish. People might care about the local or distant poor, about the future or past, about high-level values like tradition, or low-level values like the price of milk. But the important starting point is that people care about things and understand their own values. Second, the model holds that because citizens want to promote their values through politics and other means, they learn how the world works. They discover what politics can and can't accomplish and how. They learn how the economy functions, what the government can do, what sorts of laws could be implemented, and what sorts of results those laws might have. They learn the relevant facts and some of the social scientific knowledge needed to understand those facts or predict what causes what. Citizens thus adopt what we might call, non-pejoratively, an ideology, by which I mean an organized and largely coherent set of political principles. At the very least, they form somewhat stable preferences about what policies they want to see implemented. These ideologies result from a combination of citizens' values plus their beliefs about how the world works. Some citizens become conservative, some left-wing, some authoritarian, some centrist, some libertarian, and so on. Third, citizens use elections and other occasions for participation as means to implement their preferred types of policies. They thus examine the different political parties and candidates on the menu. They support the candidates and parties they think will best realize their values. Sometimes this means voting for a candidate who shares their ideology, but sometimes, if that candidate has no chance of winning, they vote for the second or third best option with a better shot. At the same time, political parties and politicians want to win. They recognize that to win, they need votes, and to get votes, they need to push the policies the people want. Political parties compete for votes the way tech companies compete for dollars. Thus, what voters want determines what the parties offer and try to do. Because of this, after an election takes place, the winning candidates tend to share and try to implement the values, policy preferences, and ideologies of their supporters. Lawmakers pass new laws, regulations, and policies that reflect citizens' overall ideological preferences, or at least reflect a kind of compromise among their disparate preferences. Lawmakers will respond to the goals and preferences of the many, if not literally all. According to the 6th grade model, democracy disciplines winning lawmakers because they know the next election is coming. Just as Apple wants you to be a repeat customer, so do the Social Democrats or nationalists. Politicians know that come the next election, citizens will evaluate how well they performed. If candidates failed to keep their promises, did a bad job, were corrupt and unethical, or if the policies they implemented, even if the people wanted them, produced bad results, citizens will vote them out. The technical term for this behavior is retrospective voting. This is perhaps the most common and widely shared empirical model of how democracy works today. It models democracy as a kind of market, so this model makes democracy seem appealing the way that markets seem appealing. Democracy is a form of trade and exchange by other means. People know their interests, and democracy enables people to get what they want. Over the course of this book, we will examine how this kind of model arose. Some philosophers and social scientists think it is more or less correct, while others think nearly every piece of it is mistaken. But perhaps more interesting and surprising is that many of the arguments for and against democracy have nothing to do with this model at all. 5 big values. When people advocate democracy, even if they think democracy is an end in itself, they value it for a reason. There must be some underlying value that democracy promotes, realizes, or instantiates that explains why democracy is good or just. In this book, I will focus on 5 values that figure most prominently in the most important historical texts. These 5 values get the most discussion and seem to be something that everybody, not just professional theorists, cares about. These values are stability, virtue, wisdom, liberty, and equality. Regarding stability, I have in mind questions and concerns like this. Will the government collapse into civil war? How can we give people enough stake in their government to ensure that they get along with each other and go along with the rules? Will there be constant factionalism and internal conflict? Will our governments go to war with other governments, or will we have peace? Will people be willing to follow and respect the law, or will they resist it because they see it as an imposition? Regarding virtue, I have in mind questions like these. Does democracy tend to make people morally better or worse? Does it encourage them to become active, intelligent, benevolent, and upright, or to become passive, stupid, selfish, or venal? Will it enhance or demote their character? Regarding wisdom, I have in mind questions like these. Does democracy make smart or good choices? Does democratic decision-making tend to track objective or procedure-independent facts about which policies are efficient, effective, just, or good? What counts as a smart choice? Are there any external standards by which to judge the quality of democratic decisions? Or are democratic decisions good simply because they are democratic? Can democracy make smart choices even if most citizens are badly informed, tribalistic, and/or irrational? Does democracy tend to promote prosperity or demote it? If we want to produce good outcomes, how much democracy is optimal? And can too much democracy be a bad thing? Regarding liberty, I have in mind questions like these. What is freedom, and will democracy promote or demote it? Does democracy increase or reduce citizens' ability to lead the lives they want to lead? Will government be a mechanism by which to dominate others, or can democracy instead prevent such domination? Is participating in government itself a way of being autonomous or free? Does democracy merely promote freedom, or is democracy itself a form of freedom? In democracy, am I forced to obey rules set by others, or does democracy somehow ensure I am bound only by laws I set for myself? Regarding equality, I have in mind questions like these. Is democracy good because it is fair, or because it makes people equal in some important way? Is it right that there should be no division between who rules and who obeys, even if some people are smarter, more competent, or more virtuous than others? Should democracy produce equal outcomes, or is it sufficient that it has equal inputs? How should democracy cope with actual inequalities that grant some people more de facto power than others? What should democracy do about persistent minorities who, while nominally equal, have no real power? Over the next 10 chapters, I will present the best or most important historical arguments for and against democracy in terms of these 10 values. Each value will get a pair of chapters. The first chapter will be a guided tour of arguments holding that democracy realizes or enhances that value. The second will examine skeptical and critical arguments to the contrary. You might notice these values and concerns are interrelated. For instance, the chapters on virtue will focus on how democracy affects the virtue of its citizens, including their intellectual virtue. But immediately afterward, we will examine the question of whether democratic institutions as a whole tend to make wise decisions. This is different from, but closely related to, the question of whether democracy makes individual citizens more or less wise. Does the wisdom of the crowd depend upon the wisdom of the individual members of that crowd? Or might democracy be wise, even if most individual citizens are not wise? Similarly, concerns about freedom and equality are closely related. If some people oppress other people, that evinces a lack of freedom. But perhaps political inequality is the mechanism behind such oppression. People oppress others because they have differential levels of power. The solution, some say, is equal power. This book is a historical guided tour of arguments for and against democracy. Thus, in each chapter I begin somewhere in the West's intellectual past and move toward the present day. Further, one reason I start with values like stability and virtue, but end with freedom and equality, is that people in the past tended to be more concerned with the former, while people today tend to be more concerned with the latter. Indeed, today you see few philosophers writing about stability, but earlier theorists who had lived through civil wars, world wars, bloody revolutions, and conquests were deeply concerned about it. Intellectual historians get something right. What we consider important often depends on our historical contexts. What is democracy?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?